Okay, I'd like to call the second meeting of the evening to order. This is of the Urbana City Council. Again, it's Monday, December 4th, 2017. Will the clerk please call the roll?
City Council members Ammons. Here. Brown.
Here.
Hazen.
Here.
Jacobson.
Here.
Miller.
Here.
Roberts.
Here.
Wu.
Here.
Mayor Marlin.
Here. Next up is approval of minutes of the previous meeting, November 20th, 2017. Is there a motion for approval?
I will motion.
Second.
Moved by Dean, seconded by Aaron. Any corrections? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. Those minutes are approved. Any additions to the agenda? Aaron?
Yes, I'd like to move that Daryl Cruz be allowed to do a 10-minute presentation on the IDOT traffic stop data.
I'll second that.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Okay, well, Daryl Cruz has asked to speak at the time of the agenda item. Is that acceptable?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay.
Okay.
Eric?
Not a lengthy agenda item, but I'd just like to, would like to mention my concern that I've also, you've heard about in email, about apparent racial discrimination on the part of Suburban Express bus, which does do business in Urbana. So I've sent an email to Basilia Clark to ask her to, what our options are with respect to that, because it affects a number of Urbana residents.
Ms. Clark is the Human Relations Officer, and this would be a matter for the Human Relations Commission. Okay, thank you. Next up is public input. I have 3 people who've indicated they'd like to speak, all at the time of the IDOT traffic report. Is there anyone who wishes to address the City Council? Okay.
Should we do it after Daryl speaks? What should be the order?
Yes, at the time of the agenda item. Yeah. Well, actually, Belden, you submitted your card first, so if you'd like to go first. No, not now, but at the time of the agenda. Okay. Unfinished business, there is none. We have 2 items from the Committee of the Whole last week. Councilmember Jared Miller.
All right, so last week we met as the City Council Committee of the Whole, and there was a resolution and ordinance that were forwarded to the full council with recommendation for approval. And so on behalf of the committee, I'm going to move resolution number 2017-11-075R, resolution accepting Ameren Energy Efficiency Staffing Grant Incentive for approval.
Second.
Moved by Jared, seconded by Eric. Is there any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. That motion passes.
On behalf of the committee, I will also move ordinance number 2017-11-068, an ordinance approving amendment number 1 to a power purchase agreement with WCP Solar Services.
Second.
Moved by Jared, seconded by Mary Alice. Any discussion? All those in favor, please, roll call. Will the clerk
Ordinance,
please
yeah.
call the roll?
Councilmembers Ammons.
Yes.
Brown.
Yes.
Hazen.
Yes.
Jacobson.
Yes.
Miller.
Yes.
Roberts.
Yes.
Wu.
Yes.
That motion passes. That concludes the business from the committee. Reports of special committees. Okay. Reports of officers. Seeing none. I did want to update folks that we applications for the city administrator position will close on December 8th. As of about a week ago, we had over 45 applications, so I suspect we'll end up with 50 or more. So that's going well, and we're working out the process for scheduling interviews, which will be after the first of the year. So it's a very, very, we're pleased with the response. Okay, next up is new business, which is the IDOT Traffic Study Quarterly Report follow-up discussion. So we'll do public input first. We have 3 people who wanted to speak. And Chief Morgan has an update in response to some of the questions that were raised last week by council members, and then we'll open this up for discussion. Yeah, he's one of the 3. Okay, so we'll start with Belden Fields.
Yes, I mean, I've been before this council a number of times on the same issue. I've made some recommendations about how to deal with the equipment stops and so on. I don't think they were followed up on, and I'm not sure that I'll bother making them again. But let me say, I don't fault the city of Urbana in terms of trying to bring about a change in terms of the attitudes of some members of the police department. I sat in on, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, you were there, Aaron, with Anthony Cobb when we had an outside specialist come in and gave a presentation and tried to involve the officers in some innovative ways on how officers can mistakenly react to stops that they make and not be conscious of what they are doing and what they are saying. I also participated in a meeting with police chiefs of this area that Anthony Cobb of the NAACP called. There were a couple of African-American police chiefs involved in that, one former marshal who was also African-American in that, and I think it was an interesting session, but there was something else that I have been involved in that always was in the back of my mind, and that is the program at the Police Training Institute. Helen Neville in the College of Education has run for now, what is it, 5, 6 years, a program over there. I participated along with Anthony Cobb, the chief of the university police, I think maybe former Chief Connolly was involved in that session on the design of that program. And up until this year, when I couldn't make it, I had a conflict, I participated in a panel of police officers and civilians talking about the issues of policing in a multiracial society. And I've got to tell you that the responses by those younger officers that were sitting there, I refer to them as cadets, they're really just recently hired officers, has not been very positive. The other thing that is disappointing is that over the years, the composition of those officers in terms of ethnicity has not changed much. They are largely white officers that you are talking to, many of whom come from areas in which they have had no contact with African American or Latino people, but will be policing, some of them probably in cities in which there will be African American and Latino people. And I've been thinking about this with all of these efforts that have gone on. How can we crack this? How can we change this? Maybe People like me shouldn't be on that panel. Maybe some of the other people in the community who are on it shouldn't be on that panel. Maybe it should be mayors.
1 minute, Mr. Fields.
Talking to them about the seriousness with which they regard this and how important it is to their cities to be sensitive about difference when they're doing it. Maybe the city, and we're going to have the Police Training Institute, I guess, here for at least 3 more years. We don't know about after that. But while there is the proximity to it, maybe people from the 2 cities and maybe some other communities should get together and see if this not could be stressed. But the conclusion that I have drawn is that we're not going to get anywhere until we diversify the police forces. And just as I have seen very little difference over the 5 or 6 years in the body of these new police officers coming in to serve, I've seen very little difference in the composition of the police departments in the 2 cities that we live in. My recommendation would be that there be outreach programs developed. You can advertise your positions in papers like the Defender in Chicago. You can advertise them over black radio, black television. You can contact Black Police Officers Association, such as they have in Chicago, and try to recruit some officers from there to come down here. But I think until that move is made, until you really get a diverse police force, you can hold as many meetings as you want, as many sensitivity trainings as you want. And I don't think we're going to get anywhere on this. Regrettably, I just don't. Thank you.
Thank you. Ken Salo?
Hi, good evening, and thanks for the opportunity to speak. I think, well, let me use a minute just to give a shout out to Daniel's presentation, because I think that's the crucial focus on the sort of humanitarian cost of this deeply unequal society economy that we're going through. The flip side, of course, is the skyrocketing rentals just down the road at this place that I teach at, where we have luxury student apartments. And so that's the other part that's driving this unaffordability in housing. So I think some sort of focus on the affordability of housing costs and the impact of university-related housing on the city resident housing is perhaps a useful approach to also think through the question, but just again, the shout out to the humanitarian cost of this. So I think, like Belden, I've been part of groups such as the Citizens for Peace and Justice to think through, well, what is of course not an easy but extremely complex problem of these, well, at its most dystopian aspects, the sort of long, difficult history of racialized state violence against specifically black bodies. And one of the things that I'm convinced of, if there's in some sort of a dystopian future, is maybe to draw council's attention to what now seems to be a sort of down the memory hole, the question and issue of Ferguson. So I think Ferguson is an important study to refocus again, and there's a very important video called Ferguson, the Report from Occupied Territory, just to give an idea of where things can go to if there aren't preventative steps taken, and the huge upsurge that we've seen to that. So I'll just sort of recommend that specifically, but let me add that I think the IDOT study statistically, which flags only the racialized aspects, is but maybe a sliver, it's a small part of. I think there are other factors that maybe are playing in that are more deeply and structural. Clearly one question which the IDOT study doesn't cover, but it's all woven into all of this, is the question of poverty. I mean, this is a policing specifically against poor people or driving inadequate, vehicles. So I think the mobility of poor people might be another question, specifically public mobility, so public utility as opposed to private. We heard the report about the Suburban Express line, and thanks for that mention. So I think public mass transit is also a key aspect that perhaps needs to fold into this. I think, and then lastly, what I want to suggest also is, in my reading of this, an aspect that perhaps needs further attention is the deeply segregated spatial nature of this policing. It's not a general. These stops are happening in particular areas where there's a geography to this. So that deeply residential, and that's got a deep history of residential segregation, which has been driven by the unaffordability of housing, and my view of it is just going to get deeper and worse, and short of the sort of containment and control type strategies that Ferguson policing has resulted or adopted, and we saw the consequences of that. Some sort of a preventative measure and a public stance by the City Council might go a long way to kind of first, flag that this is a serious issue. It's got deep structural roots, and that it needs an all-in approach from people who understand the spatial dimensions, all right, and how they fall into the racial question, the economic, and of course also the gender issues. So from a sort of urban or city point of view, the question of public transit and housing affordability are key structural drivers of this racialized inequalities. Thank you very much.
Eric?
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. To what extent do you think actual housing discrimination, inability of African Americans to actually even be shown or buy or rent housing outside of areas that are already predominantly African American, how big a role do you think that plays in the situation that you've described?
Yeah, well, my own opinion aside, I mean, there's sort of compelling studies about these biases within the real estate industry, and that might be another factor about how realtors are, consciously or unconsciously, because they're driven by other aspects, but those sort of implicit biases within the real estate industry, which is driven by the incentives that they have for what they call racial steering. So these are well-established factors, and I think they all fold into. I'm not sure if that responds to the question.
Yeah, I've had, it's been a while, but I've had some experience in open housing activism, and what we found, it was a different place from here. It was in the Cleveland area, but it wasn't implicit bias. It was explicit bias.
Well, I mean,
it was
I don't know.
a strategy.
I think maybe with an eye to what happened last night in the dead of night. I mean, there's a highly profitable industry in flipping houses and real estate that's driving, and particularly causing these urban dystopias that are playing out now as we speak, and it's only going to get worse. I mean, lastly, I mean, it's a tragedy is what happened to public housing. I mean, there's really been no public housing since the Second World War. So this is all a perfect storm of issues that are playing out at the points of contact of racialized policing. Thank you.
One more.
Dean?
You're in a hurry to get out of here, aren't you?
Oh, no.
I just wanted to thank you for recognizing that there is an economic component to the problem that we're discussing here. At the last meeting we had, I brought that up, and I don't think I even got one head nod from anybody. I was a police officer for over 23 years in multiple communities, including an Indian reservation. And I know in my heart that this is about economics. Everybody's locked on to implicit bias, which is something that every human being on earth has for, whether they want McDonald's or Burger King, or they don't like this, or they don't like that, or they've had bad experiences and they've developed opinions, whatever. This is deeply about economics, and the problem here is that we have too much of a disparity in incomes in this country. Although we have a country where even if you're poor, you've probably got a cell phone and some sort of transportation, and you're probably eating compared to other parts of the world.
Yeah.
But the disparity in income here in this country is so radical that it's causing some of these problems. And there are several reasons police are more present in zones where there are lower incomes. And I just want to thank you for being smart enough to recognize that.
No, thank you very much. But again, let me also add that, again, of course, we might want to tease out each issue separately to help think through it. But these, in a society like this, every issue, particularly economic, is deeply racialized given the history of slavery and so forth. So, I mean, trying to tease those out, but just to add that they all kind of folded, you know, together, and so it's a deeply complex problem.
It becomes an unintended consequence. And I come from a place where it would be very hard to find a person who wasn't Norwegian. Okay?
It wasn't, sorry?
Who wasn't Norwegian, and I'm one of them. I'm not. I'm actually Middle Eastern and Hispanic, but I grew up in a place where everybody was Norwegian,
Right.
and in South Dakota back in the 70s, and the brunt of the police patrols were done in the lower income neighborhoods. There were no African Americans or anybody else. Everybody was Norwegian.
Right.
But guess what? The police were present in the lower income areas, and
Well, that's maybe from one way to segue to what Belden was sharing with you. I think the fact that the society is so deeply not only racialized but segregated also means that people aren't policing their own neighborhoods. And I think that's one of the key drivers. And maybe there was a time when Champaign and Savannah was being policed by people who lived in that neighborhood, and that makes a heck of a difference.
Okay.
thank you for coming.
Last up is Daryl Cruz, and set the clock for 10 minutes.
Are you gonna, do you need the computer? Do you need the computer? Just gave you 4 hours.
4 hours? We'll die.
It'll go be, it'll go beyond
Charlie
11:30.
accidentally gave you 4 hours first. Fidel Castro speech.
4 hours discussing it though, but I'm not going to take 4 hours because it deserves that discussion. First of all, I want from the dialogue that I presented on the first page, which I hope everybody's got a copy of. Does everybody receive that? Well, I have a couple of additional things, so it needs to get around to everybody before I start. We can do that. And while we're waiting for everybody to receive that, I have to make a statement that I totally reject what was just said by Mr. Hazen, that traffic stop disparities are driven by poverty. They are not. They are driven by the way law enforcement enforces traffic laws in the community. And poverty should have no relevance to that outcome. And if it does, then we need to analyze how we're policing different neighborhoods. So I'll start by saying, I hope you had a chance to read the attached comments prior to this evening. I'm not going to rehash every point, but I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have. I'm going to focus on the data presented last week. You spent a lot of money to gather data. So let's be honest and let's start looking at the data and not feelings, intuitions, or gut feelings. Let's look at data for a minute. Tonight, the City Council should have focused its attention and discussion on UPD traffic enforcement policy patterns as a possible contributing factor to the traffic stop racial disparities, not revisiting past city actions identified in slides 2 through 4 that have no effect to date on reducing racial disparities. We need to move the discussion to a totally different place. With this in mind, I begin with a question. Does the UPD annually review its traffic enforcement efforts and locations to ensure that they align in practice with departmental policy, namely that enforcement locations will be based upon traffic volume, traffic conditions, and accident rates? The UPD policy 500 is attached, and I'd like you to turn it. I highlighted in yellow. It's the 6th page. It's on the city's website, and it simply says, traffic enforcement techniques are based on what I just read, and the goal of traffic law enforcement is to reduce collisions. That's what we do traffic law enforcement for, and we need to keep that in mind. It's not for other things that sometimes we think should be going on. But that's the primary goal, street safety, to reduce collisions or accidents. This policy is to guide and direct UPD to where traffic law enforcement is needed. Essentially, UPD policy infers traffic enforcement should not be influenced or dictated by calls for service, crime rates, or the racial makeup of a neighborhood. Traffic law enforcement serves a unique community safety purpose, and that should not be conflated with other policing responsibilities, of which there are many. And unfortunately, I think that's what's muddled this whole issue. For example, some are suggesting that calls for service are influencing where officers patrol, thus account for the racial disparity. Even though a correlation may exist, it has not been proven that a cause and effect exists. But for a moment, let's just assume it's true. Then are we asserting that this is an explanation or a justification of the racial disparity? Certainly calls for service cannot be used to justify or legitimize traffic stop racial disparities. It may explain it, but you can't accept it or legitimize it if you think it's true. If calls for service are a reason for racial disparities, then the UPD should be motivated to make appropriate changes to its policing traffic enforcement strategies to counteract this influence to reduce the disparity. Is this being done? This internal reassessment and retraining should not be that difficult. That's pretty fundamental in any organization. Moving on. It's important to keep the following facts in the forefront of tonight's discussion. African American drivers make up roughly 17 to 18% of the driving public, yet they compose over 30% or more of all the stops. Approximately 69% of all drivers in Urbana streets are Caucasian, but compose only 57% of the stops. If accident frequency is one of the three important factors for determining where traffic enforcement should occur, we must remind ourselves that 82% of all accidents do not even involve African American drivers in Urbana. Especially critical to tonight's discussion is the fact that UPD data tells us the last 6 months, 98.75% of all stops are motivated by a typical traffic or community caretaking issue. Let that fact sink in. That's a data fact. These are normal routines that one would think would not be impacted by race, but somehow they are. We have to ask why. Excluding racial bias or profiling for a moment, one logical answer might be the locations where UPD is conducting traffic stops as compared to where they are not. Turn to the density of race by race on page 20. That's slide 20. I copied it. It's this picture right here. Okay. That's identity by race profile that the UPD has produced, attached on the back. Once the mirror images of African American and Caucasian stops locations such as Lincoln, Cunningham, and University Avenue are removed, the remaining stop locations by race are remarkably disparate. And I would ask you simply to turn to the back. And we take off the mirror images where evidently traffic stops occur and there's no difference. Then all of a sudden we have a stop map that looks like this. It looks like this. Okay. Why does this exist? Where African American drivers are prominently stopped on secondary streets, there is little evidence of Caucasian drivers being stopped, even on those streets, even though they too use them. This appears highly unusual since 68% of the driving public is Caucasian. In summary, once the mirrored images of stops are removed, it appears Caucasian drivers' stops occur along Windsor Road, while African American drivers are stopped on Bradley Avenue, Washington Street, Florida Avenue, and Philo Road. If the primary purpose of conducting traffic stops is to ensure driver safety and minimize accidents, should not traffic stops be conducted equitably throughout the city based solely on traffic, volume, conditions, and accident rates? On page 19 of the Traffic and Most Traveled Roads, it's attached on the back. If you take a look at that particular map, I highlighted intersections by stars where there is no density of traffic stops occurring. These are voids compared to the data that's here. Look at where they're located. Why are they in those intersections? And I assume these streets all represent similar traffic volume for the most part.
You have 1 minute, Mr. Cruz.
Okay. Page 19 density of the Traffic and Most Traveled Roads is attached. Represented by the stars are those intersections. These appear to be traffic enforcement voids that are mostly located in predominantly Caucasian neighborhoods. For safety reasons, isn't the need for traffic enforcement just as important at these locations for those drivers in those parts of town as on Bradley and Washington Street? Does this data picture suggest a possible explanation for the disparity problem as well as a potential solution? Whether this enforcement pattern is intentional or unintentional is not the point. Regardless, it needs to be addressed immediately. To not respond to the imbalance of traffic enforcement locations is to suggest African American drivers need more intense traffic law enforcement than Caucasian drivers. That would be a race-based conclusion that cannot be accepted in Urbana. Therefore, I would like to offer one recommendation for you to consider tonight, and it's on page 5 of the papers that you have. If I could just be given a minute to read it.
I'd like to move for
For
one
the
more minute
public.
at a time for Durrell to finish his recommendation.
I'd like to second that.
Okay. It's on page 5 and it's highlighted in black. Excluding Lincoln, Cunningham, and University Avenues, the City Council should direct the police chief to do an immediate review of all traffic stop data involving all secondary streets and intersections in Urbana. If it's determined that secondary streets and intersections of similar traffic volume and accident rates are being over or under policed, officers should be directed to readjust their traffic enforcement efforts to reflect equivalency and equity in the enforcement of traffic laws. Careful planning and execution of traffic law enforcement should include filling voids where they exist and reducing enforcement to a reasonable level where it is currently excessive. In particular, traffic enforcement along Bradley and Washington Avenues should be reassessed to provide equivalent traffic enforcement time and effort where voids in other neighborhoods exist. The goal is to provide traffic enforcement at equitable levels on secondary streets and intersections throughout the city based on traffic volume, conditions, and accident rates alone, not the racial density of drivers, calls for service, crime rates, or a specific neighborhood for any reason other than traffic safety. As part of its quarterly data reporting, the UPD should produce spatial density maps of accident numbers, traffic volume, and density stop rates by race to monitor and ensure that traffic law enforcement efforts in the locations are based on objective traffic data and implemented in a fair and equitable manner throughout the city. Thank you.
Thank you. I've received 3 other cards for public input. Carol Inskeep. Thanks, Drew. Is Carol here?
I saw her come in.
She may have left.
Maybe she.
Oh, I'm sorry, she chose not to address members, but asked that she wants to express her continuing concern about the ongoing racial disparity in traffic stops. That's my fault. Martel Miller?
Martin Miller, Urbana. I wasn't going to speak until it was said that the stops was done on what people make, but on income. My mind going blank because here's what I want to say. When we talk about police and the way I see it as an African American man, and I've been watching the police for 12 years. It goes on officer's discretion. You know, if the officer decides to stop you, not stop you. In our community, we mostly get stopped. You know, I rode around for, I say about a year and see, because a lot of cars get stopped and not having license plates in the front. And I had a chart that I kept. And the most vehicle, the number one vehicle that I found didn't have license plates in the front was a Ford F-150 truck. And who drives that? You know, and not a lot of black men drive that Ford F-150 truck. There's a few. But if you look up, and you can ride around now, and you will see that. They don't have their license plates. But that was the reason a lot of African-American people get stopped for having one license plate. And that comes from officer discretion. So it should have been a lot of white men with tickets for not having a license plate in the front. But that didn't happen. So to me, it's done by officer discretion. And if he decides when he wants to stop someone black, that's what he does. He don't stop the white person for having a missing license plate. You know, and that's some things we got to look at. What are the officers doing? Look at the officer's stopping record. Who's he stopping? You know, and if it's 60% of the people driving is Caucasian, and he's stopping 30% of African Americans and 20% of Caucasian, something is wrong with his math anyway. You know, because I'm telling you, if you go out there and watch the people drive, you see the same people doing the same thing. You stay on Illinois Street. Illinois Street is, you think they're getting on the interstate. You know, coming down Illinois Street, they need to put another stop sign on Illinois Street. Right. If you got, and we got schools over there. We got a school block away. And people come down that street, and I guarantee you can clock them sometime doing about 45, 50 miles an hour. And they got to stop when they get up here to Race Street. But there ain't no officer sitting there looking at that traffic. I wonder why. Who stays in that neighborhood? And that's all I got to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Last public input card is from Robert King.
Good evening. Thank you all for letting me speak. This is Robert King, and I live in Urbana, of course. So I just had a couple of comments. Having seen the report, first of all, I was thankful that this is something that the city does, and I'm hoping that the city will definitely continue to do this. It feels like there's a national movement to improve policing in every town across the country. And one of the ways that I think we'll be able to do that is to continue to review data and have a hard look at, as Darrell pointed out, the numbers and all of the stats that we're actually able to see from these different studies. But I also wanted to speak to the lived experience as well. I've lived in Urbana now for 6 years, and it's unfortunate, but I have been stopped at least 3 times while rolling through my community. For each of the times, it wasn't, I didn't get cited for anything. Actually, I think twice when I asked why was I stopped, at one time someone mentioned they were looking out for my safety, and one time someone said that I pulled away from a stop sign a little too slowly, and another time I think it literally is just my vehicle types. I have a vehicle that has tinted windows, and I have become somewhat aware that when I'm driving through certain areas, I let my windows down so that people can see inside of my vehicle, because I found that when my windows are up, and not just here but in other places, I have been pulled over, and my kids have been in the vehicle with me, and the first thing they ask is, "Dad, did you have your windows down?" Because they recognize it too, because I've been pulled over quite a few times, 3 times here, but in other places. And so I just wanted to just speak to that and just say that I think if you dig deep and you're able to pull the numbers, I do ask that you continue to hear the people, listen to your public, listen to the people that are experiencing whatever's happening in the streets. And then finally, I would just say to the police chief and the folks that are doing this, if you all could find a way to also integrate whatever practices that you propose or that come out of the study with the city of Champaign, the university, and also the county as well, I think that would be, or the sheriff, I think that would be great if you all could find some uniform way of trying to address the disparities that are pretty evident and move forward together. So, thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other member of the public who wishes to address the council? Okay. Chief Morgan, did you want to give a update on what's transpired since last week?
So first, I just wanted to let you know about the things that came up last time and what we kind of came up with a game plan on getting some information back to you. I did pull up the UCR, which is a Uniform Crime Report data information. I got a link I'm going to send out to you in an email. So it's a little bit of an explanation on the best way to kind of look for the crime rates in Urbana. Those are the ones that were mandated to report. So you can compare those to other cities and things like that. So I'm going to get that out to you guys in an email. The marijuana stats, what came up last time, Melissa's going to be working on a report for that, and I hope to get you a staff report update on that within the next few weeks at a meeting. And then we're going to do a short presentation on the grant covering the highlights of that next week when we do the budget amendment for that, for the grant. And then the breakdown on the traffic stops by ethnic group along Lincoln Avenue is also something that Melissa is working on to get a spreadsheet together so we can get that to you as well. That's what I have from last week.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions for Chief at this point? Mary Alice?
And I don't know if this is appropriate to ask this question at this time. So I'm curious, one of the things that, as you look over the distribution of the stops and you look at the step stops versus the non-step stops, notice that there is a shift in the location of the step stops. So I'm wondering if you could walk us through what is the process that the police department determines where they're going to set up step stops?
So it's based on several different things. It's not something that we have, like I can say, well, this is a formulary, this is how we go about doing that. We have notorious spots where we always have speeders, and so we will focus on those that have been notoriously a problem. Then we also will look at the accident data as well. So if there's been a spike in accidents or change in accidents in a certain area, then we'll also utilize that information to focus in on certain areas. And then occasionally there'll be, the most recent one I can think of was along Broadway Avenue. Since they removed the bricks there on Broadway, we got some complaints through the Traffic Commission about people now, because the bricks aren't there, they're driving faster down Broadway. So we set up the speed trailer there for a while, and they did a speed study there through Public Works, and they were able to determine that, yeah, there was a problem there. So now we've started doing a lot of step details up on Broadway. So those are some of the ways that the step gets chosen for locations. And we also have some strictly school zone related step details, so that, you know, we try to make the rounds around all the different school zones so that we can try to keep people slowed down in the school zones and that as well.
So how often are the accident data reviewed to figure out if there's some place that we should be policing?
I'm going to have to double check, but I think at least once a year that we get a report on, like, to see if there's been a change or a spike or anything in the accident reports in a certain location. But I can double check on that for you.
So I assume, I mean, if I can kind of break it down into a couple of categories here, I assume that the trouble spots, we'll say, the speeders probably on Cunningham, probably on Lincoln, maybe on Windsor, those are kind of known, right? I mean, those aren't really shifting, is what I'm saying. Those are constant. The accidents, it seems like we potentially review that once a year. We look at the accidents and whether or not they're shifting in terms of where accidents are occurring. Changes in the roadway, so those are ad hoc. We do different things with Public Works. I'm also assuming that community complaints about speeders, that also is done ad hoc. Is there a process for that? How do community complaints come into play when we're looking at step stops?
So a lot of times if, say, somebody complains about a speeder in a certain area, we will send a police officer. We can either send a police officer out there to monitor it for a few days and different times of the day or night, and whatever time that people are complaining about it, try to see if we see an issue. We also have a speed trailer which will document, it takes data in on whether or not people are speeding along a certain road. I'm sure you've seen them, the ones that flash the, you know, how fast you're going as you approach them. Sometimes we'll utilize that also to see if the complaint is worth sending an officer to that particular location to spend time there. So when we do the step details, they're overtime, so we want to make sure that we're sending them to places where we get the most effective use of them.
So do you know, and you might not know off the top of your head, Washington and Bradley, those are two areas that we've been doing step stops. Do you know what precipitated that shift?
So a shift, what do you mean a shift?
Well, I mean, at least looking at the data, it looks like we have more stops in those two locations, whereas they weren't there in the past, I don't think.
Okay. Well, as long as I've been a police officer, people have sped down Bradley Avenue like it was a raceway. Honestly, from Lincoln Avenue to 4th Street, there's nothing stopping them. So that's been a long-standing issue as people speeding down Bradley Avenue. So I don't know if there ever was a dip in that. I'm not familiar with what you're talking about as far as.
No, I'm just trying to figure
Okay.
out for the step stops, right? So is it,
Right.
are you, so out of the four groups that I kind of did, the area where people are speeding a lot, that it's just kind of known that they're speeding a lot, I guess what I'm hearing you say is that's always been Bradley. Bradley's a well-known
Right, that's why I
speeding
thought you were
zone.
saying there was a change, and I was unaware of what that was. I'm sorry.
So I guess my question is, has it always been a step area? Is that,
It has been for a long time. I remember working that when I was a police officer on the street, working that as a step detail.
okay.
So I think it has, and maybe there may have been periods of time where, you know, we haven't done it for a while, or we only do it once a month there, but it's as far as I know, has always been a step location.
Okay. And then Washington Street?
Yeah, so Washington's an issue between Vine Street and Philo usually. We have a lot of speeders there, and then also again from Learman out to Kinch, that we have a lot of speeders at that particular area as well.
So if you look at the disparity between African Americans and Caucasians, it seems to me like there's a higher concentration in those two areas, on Bradley and on Washington. I'm wondering if it would be possible for you to give us the number of step stops, not the stops, but setups, we'll say, that we've done over the past year. So how many times did we send an officer out specifically to those locations to set up a time frame? That would be helpful if we could know that.
Okay.
Do we have the numbers, just basically? Is it roughly, what's the spread? What's the average number of, for all of these different setups?
I'm sure we can get that. Yeah, so they are required to fill out paperwork whenever they do a step detail, so
Okay.
we do
All
have
right.
it. I just have to get it.
Okay, because that would be interesting to see, if we could see if there's certain areas that we do more steps. Maybe we do on Cunningham. Maybe we put people there, 3 times a month. But it would be interesting to see, especially since those two kind of hot spots, I'll call them, stand out across that map. All right,
Okay,
so I
sure.
will let other people ask questions
Okay.
now. Thank you.
Dennis?
Sylvia, does Urbana's procedure for choosing hotspots for policing, is it essentially different than other communities in our area?
I'm not sure how to answer that. I don't know what Champagne's procedure is on how they do things, so I'm not sure I can answer that appropriately.
What level of administrative police position, whether it's a lieutenant, police lieutenant, or division chief, or whatever, or is it a beat officer who chooses what is a hot spot and where to set one up? So is it an administrative thing that comes down to the officers, or do the officers themselves make the decision?
On where they're going to patrol?
Where they're going to set up do a hot spot policing effort?
Do you mean for traffic stops
Yes.
or just in general?
Traffic stops.
Okay. So I basically, I would say that the same information, there's not a directive given out that says, I need you to stop people on Bradley Avenue because they speed there, for instance. But in addition to step stops that we do conduct details on Bradley Avenue, the beat officer also knows that that's a problem area where we have a lot of speeding. So they will sometimes go up there while they're doing their normal patrol duties in that area, and they'll run radar there or watch the stop sign at Fairview and Goodwin, which is always a problem as well near the school there. So they have a knowledge of where there are traffic problems based on their patrolling and responding to accidents in their beat, and as well as getting, if we're just talking about traffic, I guess we'll just stick with that. But that's generally how they will choose how to do traffic enforcement in their beat.
Okay, so my question is to ask or to find out whether it's whether the locations are being determined by a higher level senior officer in the police department, that these spots will be the ones that have responses, or is it at the discretion of the officer on the beat? In other words, you're talking about the reason why this might be important is because we're having a conversation about what's it called? I can't remember. Subtle bias. What's it called?
Implicit.
Implicit bias. And so I would assume that the higher level of the officer who makes the decision about where these locations are to be established would be more in control of avoiding implicit bias in the police department in general, rather than having your beat officer, which is your lowest level of officer authority, make the decision. And so I'm just like looking at the process that we have, wondering about ways of perhaps modifying process to eliminate what might be potential bias.
So when a when a patrol officer is on patrol in their beat and they're driving around for, maybe they're not necessarily targeting an area, that they are trained that if they see traffic violations to address them. And so it's hard to, so not all of the stops are because they decided, oh, there's a problem at this area, I'm going to sit here and watch specifically for that. But when they're going to calls and leaving from calls and driving around the streets in their beat, and they are assigned to their beats for a sign-up period, which is 6 months. We change sign-ups. Every officers are allowed to sign up and pick a shift and bid on that every 6 months. And for that 6-month period that they're on there, they are assigned to a beat and that beat only. So they get to know that beat very well, and they're very familiar with any issues that they have in that, traffic related and otherwise. So it's if you're suggesting we're directing them, I need you to specifically only look at traffic in this area of your beat, it's really difficult to do that, because then we're asking them to totally disregard traffic violations that they see when they're just on regular patrol. So it's not as easy as just directing them to do that. Does that make sense?
I can understand what you're saying, but I was wondering that if they're just patrolling in general, they're randomly going up and down various streets on their beat, and they're observing. And so if that was true, there should be greater implicit bias, less implicit bias, and more justice for the purpose of the traffic stops, because they're going to find them, they're going to be observing them equally throughout an area. And I guess the problem that I'm trying to look at is if they choose to go to one area in particular because, well, perhaps there are repeated issues there, but there's no guarantee that there'll be a repeated issue at a certain day, at a certain time, unless they're directed by events to go to a spot. So, I mean, if they get calls for service at a location and they observe a traffic violation, I understand that. But if they're just going to an area where it's known that there have been traffic violations and they're sitting there waiting for more, then we're going to have an unjust policing policy, I think. And it could be one place where we could look.
Aaron?
So just a couple of questions, I think, for each of you, if I can summarize this. Melissa, in relationship to you said last week that African-American drivers, based upon the quarters 2 and 3 of 2017, are 62% more likely to be stopped. Is that correct?
Sounds.
Okay. So I'd like to know, based upon that 62% of being more likely to be stopped, and based upon the 56% more likely to be stopped over the last 5 years, what is the economic impact based on those percentages of the African-American community, or those African-American drivers?
So that's not data that I have readily available. I can
No,
tell you
and
whether
I didn't think
somebody
you would
was
have it
ticketed
tonight.
and somebody received a warning, and then we can. I mean, can I?
So there, depending on what the violations are, there can be different fine structures for those as well. That would involve a lot of coordination with the state's attorney's office as well for finding out exactly what was paid for their violation. I could give a rough estimate, just assuming that all the citations were the $120. I could give that fairly easily. We could come up with that fairly easily. But as far as getting the exact dollar amount for tickets like the suspended driving, or if there's a no insurance ticket and all of that stuff that's handled in the court system, and that would be a lot of extra work for us to do that.
So let me rephrase the question then, and phrase it in such a way based upon what the fine is, right? You should be able to, I would think that you could reasonably deduce what the potential cost would be based upon the type of fine or the type of fee that was attached to the allegation or to the infraction.
It's
Right.
possible. So what I have available is the crime code and the crime description, or the charges that are written on the ticket, and then whether that ticket, whether it resulted in a citation or a warning. What I don't have connected directly to that is how much that costs and then what ends up happening at the state's attorney's office.
But the fine itself, is that something that we put on? But you could get that information as to whatever, if it was a speeding ticket or if it was for loud music, you would be able to get that information?
Most of the basic general tickets that are given out, I would say the majority of them are the $120 ticket. So
Okay.
that's what I was talking about. That would give a fairly good idea, but it won't account for those few that I talked about that are outside of that kind of get a fine set when you go to court. Like they're mandatory, you go to court, so the judge then sets those fees and fines for those that we don't have control over that.
So we could reasonably deduce that it'll be more than $120 then?
On those types, yes.
Okay. So I'm just trying to
So-
see exactly, or as close as possible, what the impact would be. Because
Rough numbers, just specifically on the African-American drivers that we're stopping?
I think we should do it on all of them.
Okay.
And Chief Morgan, Darrell read something about the purpose of traffic stops. Do you agree with what he read as the purpose of traffic stops?
Yes, that's what our policy says. I believe when he was quoting, I thought the policy, but I didn't hear him mention that traffic enforcement techniques are based on accident data, enforcement activity records, which would be like our crime rate and stuff, and then also on the traffic volume and traffic conditions. I didn't hear him mention that, so I just thought that was important, that is a piece of how we're directing people to do their traffic enforcement.
Melissa, you, as a statistician, when you analyze the data, what does it tell you as to why African Americans are stopped 62% more than they statistically should be?
I don't.
I'm asking Melissa.
I know you are.
Oh, okay.
But that sounds like you're asking her to read into the data. She comes up with the numbers and her methodology for analyzing those, but I don't know that she's going to be capable of answering that particular question as far as, I think what you're asking, I don't think what you're asking is a very simple answer to that question.
Well, the reason why I asked it, because I'm trying to understand, as I look through the definition of traffic stops and the purpose of it, you all collectively chose to use the crime overlay component, right? Which to me says that you have come to some particular conclusion as to why African Americans, in fact, you said it last week as to why you think African Americans are stopped more. So there is some sort of conclusion that is being deduced here. That
I'm
I
just
think
saying
is
it's
in-
not her place to say that. It's mine. That's why I'm saying the question would be for me, not for her.
Well,
So
the
I'm
reason
not
why-
saying that's the only reason. I did say that I think an important thing to remember is that in the past, we haven't had the benefit of the mapping software so that we could actually visualize some of this stuff. And so I think this is all very new. This is the third time we've seen it. And I think it is all very telling, and that it's important for us to look at. And now as we're getting into this and seeing some of the things that are going on, we've been having conversations about now, what can we do? What can we do to start undoing some of these things that have been a long time in the making? And that's, I think,
But
where
Chief,
we're
I
at.
understand that's what we're trying to do, and I'm not trying to go in any other direction but that. But as a part of understanding that, one of the recommendations, for instance, that Mr. Cruz made was that we look at how we enforce the traffic, the particular areas within the community to make sure that it's more equitable, right? And as a statistician, data tells you something.
So the reason
Right.
that I included the maps for the citizen-initiated calls for service, so this is when, it's a pretty good proxy measure for when somebody picks up the phone and dials 911 as a measure of exposure. So when police officers are spending time in areas and responding to calls in areas that we see a high concentration of calls for service, they're more likely to see a traffic violation in that area and initiate a traffic stop. That's that was the only conclusion that I was,
So
trying to make with
you-
that.
So, based upon the question I just asked, you just added your conclusion to that, and your conclusion was that basically that if officers are in a particular area more often, then it's reasonable to conclude that they're going to stop people in that particular area more often.
There appears to be a spatial correlation, and that's why that's why the density map was included like that.
Right. And so I'm asking you, is that all that the data tells you? Does it tell you, for instance, would you be able to conclude that, for instance, what Mr. Cruz offered, that there is more policing in a particular area that has more African Americans as it relates to even the step stops? Could you deduce that from the data?
I don't, I mean, I've presented the maps that I have. If there's a different way to look at that or a different way to do some of the mapping, I'm happy to listen and to look at it differently.
Okay, I just wanted to make a statement, and then I'm going to leave this alone and for other folks to chime in. So I want to take a few minutes to share some of my thoughts, observations, and lessons I've learned about implicit bias, specifically as it relates to the city of Urbana. So I was told by a leader of the civil rights movement 15 years ago that if black people want to educate our white brothers and sisters about race, then we must look at our own bias individually and collectively towards women. I have been working on that for over a decade, and it has shed light on the difficulties that many of my white sisters and brothers must face when dealing with their own implicit biases related to race. It's not easy to change, and I understand that. I also know it's impossible to change if you don't recognize and admit that you need to change. The last 15 years of my life I have spent organizing in Champaign-Urbana, and I have marched side by side with people of all walks of life. I have grown to understand more precisely what marginalized and otherized people have to endure daily in our society. My advocacy for responsibility and justice has allowed me to see more clearly the courage and commitment it takes for individuals to take a stance against the biases that often results in silencing people from those groups, dismissing their grievances as trivial, labeling them as troublemakers or even anti-American when they voice their concerns about unfair treatment. When a person from that marginalized group steps up to tell their story, it challenges many traditional customs and norms that are embedded in our culture. It is no easy task for someone from one of those marginalized groups to challenge the status quo. It makes them even more vulnerable and more of a target, and that, brothers and sisters, is precisely where I see their courage. During the council meeting on Monday, November 20th of 2017, I supported the motion of Darrell Cruz when he asked to see the contents of a staff presentation before the actual presentation about the IDOT traffic stop data. I even asked, as a duly elected alderman, to have the information placed in the council packet that we receive every Thursday in preparation for our Monday night meeting. That motion or that request was denied by Mayor Marlin. The motion by Mr. Cruz was for something that our new mayor and this council say we value: transparency. I thought the mayor or the council as a whole would prevail and that she or we would see our mistake and make the appropriate change, but that did not happen. Consequently, I found myself searching for the words to garner the support of my colleagues and trying to share something that would urge the mayor to respond in support of our request. As the discussion ensued, Mayor Marlin made it known that it was ultimately her decision to deny the request, and two of my colleagues supported the executive decision of the mayor to prevent the public or the council from viewing the slides and the graphs before the presentation. After a few more attempts to garner support, the mayor ultimately used her authority to cut the discussion and to adjourn the meeting. But my experience didn't end there. Not only was our request dismissed and our voices ultimately silenced during the council meeting, after the meeting, I was told by one of my fellow council members that I was, and I quote, full of crap. He didn't use crap, but that was the statement. And he was standing next to another council member when he said it. So what was said to me in the context of this discussion was paramount to the phrases shared with me by pillars of the civil rights movement as they described people like Jim Clark, Bull Connor, and others in the white community who liked things the way that they were. They told me that statements such as, "You're a troublemaker," "You're uppity," "You're stirring up problems where there ain't no problems here," were all clear indications of severe hostility. Back then, those statements led to heinous acts that focused on the physical mutilation of black bodies. However, I would like to point out that there were also very damaging social, emotional, and economic impacts that stemmed from those acts of violence. Personally, I'm not concerned about anyone hurting me physically, but I'm deeply concerned about how our community will process how I was silenced and denigrated for fighting for transparency and fairness. I was elected to advocate on behalf of my constituents, be a good steward of taxpayers' dollars, and make decisions in the best interest of the citizens of Urbana. As the only African American on this council, I feel the additional pressure to advocate for the hiring of more African Americans in city departments, for increasing business between the city and minority contractors, but most critically, to change the proven unfair treatment of African American and Hispanic drivers in the city of Urbana so that my black and brown brothers and sisters have a fairer shot at their economic survival and the pursuit of happiness. My ward has the highest concentration of African American voters and the African American driving population. According to our statistician, they are 62% more likely to be stopped by our police department. Over the last 5 years, only the African American and Latino or Latina driving population have stayed above their expected rate to be stopped, with the African American community driver stop rate being significantly higher than even the Latino community, except in 2014. As the person who accepts the responsibility of pointing out this unequal and unfair treatment and requesting a change, I'm told that transparency will come in the way the mayor sees fit and that I'm full of crap. I know there has been and will be a list of things presented that have been done to alleviate this issue, but the reality is that none of those things have resulted in any change in the disparity that African American drivers are experiencing in Urbana. Interestingly enough, individuals in our community, both black and white, have raised concerns about the disparate treatment of African American drivers. A task force comprised of scholars, elected officials, police officers, the NAACP president, and others was commissioned to look into the racial disparities of African American drivers, and they collectively concluded that yes, there is a disparity. Even the statistician, who changed the methodology used to determine if there's a disparity, has also said there's a disparity. As elected officials, I believe we are duty-bound in a patriotic sense to respect our power by respecting the grievances of our fellow citizens. We volunteered to serve in these seats, so it would behoove us to take into account the historical circumstances that are also relevant to the decisions we make today. For example, when a citizen makes a constitutional proposition to this body, which serves the health, rights, interests, and needs of the people of this community, then we should accommodate that request. Otherwise, we will be using our power to usurp the responsibility of the citizens under this form of government. Citizens who respectfully and willingly offer their gifts, their skills, and their talents to help this body should be celebrated, not maligned. Likewise, when citizens raise a concern about unequal treatment under the law, we should take those claims seriously as well. When dealing with the grievances of marginalized groups, we must not ignore them and perpetuate their unfair treatment. As an African American, I feel obligated, for the sake of my own sanity, the culture of my community, and the soul of America, to raise my voice in the face of all implicit bias or overt racism, especially as a member of this council. For those who have had similar experiences to my own, those who have seen my triumph over addiction and trouble with the law, and those who want to speak out but are afraid, it is imperative that they hear me give voice to the concerns that have been silenced for far too long. Therefore, I will continue to challenge the biases of my colleagues on this council and the staff at the City of Urbana, and welcome challenges of my own implicit biases, because there is no way forward, no way to change the treatment of those who are marginalized and otherized within our community without it. So in closing, I want to say to all the people who are watching me and hoping that I will continue to be a voice for justice and equity wherever I am, I will be carrying the torchlight for peace while demanding justice for all. Thank you.
I will just state clearly, we recognize there is disparity in racial disparity in traffic stops. This council has studied this issue for many years. We've invested a great deal of time and your money into getting as much possible information as we can. One of the big differences between the information we had in the past and what we've now had this year is this mapping software and the fact that it clearly, for the first time, shows the geographic location and density of traffic stops in our neighborhoods. And for me, personally, this has been one of the most illuminating parts of this whole process. I also, coincidentally, this is our traffic law enforcement policy. It's my own personal copy that I highlighted, which was almost exactly the highlights that Mr. Cruz showed tonight. So I think the key in our way forward is looking very closely at geographic location as well as our own internal policy, and that's basically what was presented by Mr. Cruz tonight. So we are working on this, and we are going to work our way forward on this, and frankly, I do see a way forward. So I want to listen to what other council members have to say tonight. That was the purpose of this discussion. Who's next? Eric and then Dean. Oh, sorry.
Okay. No, we don't want to do any anti-North Dakota things here. Or South Dakota. Yeah, wow. Oh, they all look alike. Go ahead, Dean. Okay, I guess I've got the floor. Okay, I just want to be sure, I have an impression for how beat officers actually decide how to patrol more or less intensely, but I want to be sure I understand. Am I correct that, well, I mean, a step patrol is a particular place governed completely by traffic issues, traffic and accident, and we find a lower disparity there, but we still find a racial disparity in those stops. So very likely that is implicit bias, unless for some reason we're setting up step patrols in a way that the traffic itself is biased, but that seems less likely. But now let's consider now the non-step, and you can tell me if I'm right. As I would understand it, the reason for more intensive patrols in areas where crime rates are higher is if there is a call for service for serious crime, the officer will be closer and be able to respond more quickly. Is that the logic?
Well, that definitely is a factor in that. So
Yeah.
if a police officer isn't writing a police report that they've gotten earlier in the shift, that would bring them back here to the station to do that. But otherwise, they're instructed to remain in their beat.
But when they're on the beat, and the beat is pretty big, where they would tend to focus would be my thought. I'm just trying to put myself behind the wheel. And if I had a memory, or if I even had numbers, I would be more likely to be where there was more likely to be trouble.
Yes.
And I had only one occasion, fortunately, and I didn't get hurt, but one occasion to be a victim of a serious crime. I was held up as a pedestrian at gunpoint, and I sure wanted the officer to be there as fast as possible once I was able to actually, call 911. And I would think anybody would be in that situation. So I think that part of the disparity, as well as I can understand the statistics, part of the disparity is implicit bias. The other part of the disparity is that if people happen to be living or habitually driving in an area where there's higher crime, and they're more likely to be stopped simply because that's a byproduct of where the officer is patrolling. Does that sound as though I've pretty well got that right?
I would agree with that.
Okay. So housing discrimination is not the focus of this, but it was mentioned, by one of the public participants, and I guess I echoed it then, and I would echo it again as a really serious concern that I don't think I would, without knowing any specific instances of wrongdoing. Well, actually, I will tell you a story. I will tell a story. This is a couple of decades old, but probably everybody knows Henry Mears, who was a really distinguished African-American educator. And I happened to have a conversation with him once. He was in the Urbana School District, and I casually teased him a little bit about living in Champaign. And he said, I live where I could find somebody to sell me a house. And I said, oh, that's right. I understand that. I think that I suspect, without direct knowledge, but just because of my overall knowledge of these things, that housing discrimination is actually pretty common in Urbana and Champaign, and that people are trapped in neighborhoods, that their lack of choice leads to higher rents, economic distress, and so forth. So I don't want to let go. I think what you're doing with respect to the community policing study that we'll hear in more detail about next week, that we've heard just a little bit about, I think all of the things that we can do with respect to reducing implicit bias, which, as Aaron has said, we are all subject to. We all have a tendency to like and trust people who are more like us, or the people who nurtured us when we were growing up, and we have to overcome that. And everything that we can do to help our police officers overcome that. I agree completely with what Belden says about trying to get a more diverse force, although when I was on the traffic stop study, I read so many papers on this, and one of the things, several papers said African-American police officers showed the same biases with respect to, race of people they stopped and how they disposed of those, cases as white officers. That it was that putting on the uniform was sort of overrode actual racial identity. So I think that you guys are moving in the right direction. I really do, and I hope we can move farther. I'm sure we can, but I think that I think that people. Well, in fact, there are studies on this. There were a couple of the studies that I found. There were studies in pretty big cities where they decided to try to have equity in traffic stops by balancing out patrols. So they patrolled equally in high crime areas and areas that weren't high crime, and crime rates went shooting up. People were less safe. You have to patrol more intensely in areas where there's more crime. I mean, we will sacrifice public safety if we don't do that. So anyway, those are all the thoughts that I have.
Dean.
I've determined that the way you wear your hair is causing you to marginalize me here because you can't see me. Just so you know. That was funny. Okay. I made the comment to Aaron. I take ownership for that, and based on what was taking place that evening, I think it was appropriate, and I would say it again. Although I could have explained myself or articulated my words a little bit better, I stand by what I said. Getting back to earlier here, and that's something for Aaron and I to work out peacefully and talk to each other about. I don't think that's an appropriate use of anybody else's time. I am sorry I hurt his feelings, and I will talk to him about it, but I do stand by what I said.
Did you have a comment on traffic stops?
Yes. Dennis here brought up earlier about the, he was asking questions about how, I don't think your questions were quite clear to the chief. You were talking about hot spots, and you were kind of talking about step zones at the same time, and I think they're two separate things. But what I remember happening, and I've only been gone a little more than a year, but is it not the case that the public often dictates where we set up step zones through the mechanism of calling the police department, saying, hey, I live in the 900 block of whatever street, there's been a lot of speeders. You get transferred to a lieutenant sets up a speed trailer out there that has a computer chip in it that says the time of days that people are speeding, what speeds they're driving. That information's brought back to you, chief, or to a lieutenant. And is that not how we determine where to set up many times a step detail?
That is one of the ways, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I just thought that was worth mentioning.
Yeah, and if the speed trailer isn't available or it's in another location, sometimes we would send an officer to kind of view it for like an hour in the morning, an hour in the afternoon, an hour in the evening kind of thing, just to get a gauge for, because there are certain streets in the area in the city where it appears as though people are going faster because maybe there's a curve in the road, and so it gives the appearance that people are going way faster than they are, and things like that. So sometimes we will send an officer on regular patrol to view the area as well. But yes, that is definitely one of the ways that we do it.
We're still doing that?
The speed trailer?
Yeah, we still own that, and it
Yes.
works, and we're still doing it. And
Yes.
that seems to me to be a pretty objective way to
Right.
have, ways to set up step locations.
Well, I would remind council members, and I did this many times, well, not many, several times as a council member, when a citizen would complain to me that, oh, people are driving 50 miles an hour down my street, I would contact the traffic commission, ask for this item to be put on the agenda, and they would follow up on that. So if you've got people driving 60 miles an hour down Illinois Street, you should contact your city council member, and we can get that looked at. So people anywhere in the community, if they have a traffic-related issue, the Traffic Commission meets once a month, and they are very good about addressing citizen concerns. We had another situation on McHenry Street. The latest one was Broadway. So, people call in and ask police to look at particular streets, and sometimes they're the same streets over and over, and sometimes they're new ones. But a lot of these are citizen-initiated concerns. Jared.
Thank you. So I just wanted to make one thing clear and then present another thing to council. I think that there was a very specific request that I just want to reiterate that for you, Melissa, that we look at the arterial streets as Darrell has shown in his maps, that the secondary locations where we're doing enforcement, and do a further breakdown of statistics based on those areas alone. Because now that we can spatially see it, we can kind of pull out those particular locations where we can see there isn't a great disparity, and we can look instead at the places where we are seeing it, and then we can start to analyze, which leads me into the second part, which I think where we're going with this, and I'm glad that everyone has kind of seen what Darrell is presenting and is willing to look at objectively how we're geographically treating where we're stopping drivers in Urbana. I think it's a smart way to go about it. And in addition, looking at specifically our policies based on how we stop. So I think moving forward, I'm always looking for objective and measurable results. I'm always looking for deliverables. What are we really shooting for? What are we going to get at next time? And I'm not talking about the next quarterly report. I mean, obviously, as soon as we can get what I'm about to suggest, I think it should be brought up, and we should stay active with this while it's still fresh in our minds and we're all still concerned about it, rather than waiting until the next quarter to see another report or the annual report. I don't know when the annual report is due. But so my thought is with policy, I know it is our duty as council members to be familiar with and understand all of the ordinances and policies pertaining to how the city rate operates. And some of us are new, and some of us have been here for a long time, so I'm sure there's a breadth of knowledge that exists or that doesn't. But maybe, even though it's our duty, it might not be that of our constituents, of the public. And I think that it would be good for us to look at how these suggestions are going to play out in our policies, right? So, you know, I don't know if necessarily a public presentation is the way to go. That's the way I'm leaning. Maybe it could just be individual, you know, to council members. You know, we could do 2 at a time, just like we did with other things in the past, where you can kind of educate us on, walk through how officers are directed, you know, to do stops. I think that the scope of this conversation has gone in and out of being focused and narrow and wide and overarching towards larger policing practices. And I just want to, again, reiterate what Durrell is, you know, constantly being alluding to, is that, you know, we need to keep the scope of how we're attacking this very specific to traffic stops and traffic stop enforcement. You know, how we police overall, I think, becomes a much bigger and tougher question to answer. And looking specifically at this problem, because this is the one that we know that we have, it's definitive, it's unquestionable, everybody knows that it's there. In order to help, you know, council members and everyone else figure out where we're going to go forward, I think it's important to keep that in mind. I don't know what the best way is to suggest a public versus private presentations to council. I'm open to either. I'd like to hear other council members' thoughts on that as well, just so that everybody can kind of see, you know, how it is that, you know, officers go through their routines as far as traffic stops are concerned on a day-to-day basis, on a monthly basis.
Can
I'm
I say
welcome to
something?
suggestions.
So I think what you're asking, first of all, policy doesn't dictate exactly how police officers do their job. They are a guideline on how they will conduct their duties.
Okay.
So they're guideline. So that in and of itself, and all of our policies are online for everybody to view at any time. So as far as, it would be very difficult for me to sit down and tell you, like I was explaining to Dennis, that, you know, we say, I need you to go out and stop cars at this one particular location. Aside from STEP, that happens during STEP. Police officers are trained to patrol their areas and to address traffic violations when they see them. So that's how they're directed, I guess, in general terms. We don't say, oh, you don't ever stop somebody at this intersection, or always stop somebody at that intersection. Like, that's not how we do police work. So I don't know if you're going to get, I'm not, unless you can be more specific on what you're looking for. It'd be very difficult for me to say, without taking you through a police officer's training. I don't know how I would be able to explain to you, and everybody has their own, you know, different ways of doing things, obviously. So say, for instance, you are in Beat 6-1, which is the northwest part of town. And so mostly you're where, you know, there are calls for service, and that's where the officer will generally be driving around the streets where he knows there are lots of calls for service, that there's been problems, or where he knows there's a problem house or something. But he won't spend very much time up on North Shore Drive, but he may go up there at least once or twice during his night, if for instance it's not very busy. If it is an extremely busy night, he literally will just be answering calls for service. If it's a slow night, he may run radar on one of the roads and be checking North Shore Drive to make sure that there's nobody up there trying to burglarize the businesses up there. But they certainly don't get the time up on North Shore Drive that they're getting in other higher crime areas. So some of those things are what they're taught, like through the training program. Like, you need to be in the areas where there's problems, stay close to your beat, don't go outside your beat unless you ask permission or you're coming back here to write police reports. And so I'm not sure I can specifically answer directly what you're asking me, just based on how police work is done.
Well, this is exactly what I'm getting at, is this narrative is what we need, because we can't see behind the lines of the policy. I guess that was what I was getting at. Rather than, yes, anybody can read what the policy says, but obviously that doesn't entirely dictate what happens with officers. And I know that narrative of how that happens is, you know, it's more fluid than that. You know, there is not a rule book for what you do every second of every day when you're out on a beat. But because there isn't a rule book for what you do of every second of every day on your beats, somewhere in there lies our problem. You know, we can't just wash away the idea of the disparity that exists with, well, it's just what happens. You know, we need to figure out. We need to.
Right, I'm not
tease it out.
suggesting that that's the
I know.
case.
I'm just saying, however it is, I'm looking for input on, you know, because we've got to figure out what we're gonna do about this. And I think the suggestion of geographical, you know, patrolling and equity is super important. Anyway, I digress. I see some hands raised, so I'm obviously getting some ideas from other council members. I'd like to hear what they got to say.
Yeah, I'd encourage everyone to do a ride-along. It's been a while since I've done one, but I hope to do one again soon. And even people in the community that are especially interested, they're welcome to do ride-alongs, from what I understand. There's also a Citizens Police Academy that I know, I see Barbara Kessel at, though I know you've done that. Some other people have done it that have felt that does help them understand the police role in this. One thing I'm trying to kind of understand better is, I know when I did my ride-along, we didn't spend a lot of time on traffic. It was pretty much either answering a call about, you know, a noise or you know, somebody knocking at a door, or somebody being drunk in public, or following up on a shoplifting, you know. A lot of different things officers do on their shift, and very little time was actually spent on traffic. There wasn't actually any dedicated time on the shift I was on where they were actually focusing on traffic. We pulled over somebody without a light on their bicycle, and she gave them a warning, but that was the only traffic stop she made on that shift. So looking at the numbers, it looks like there's 3,000 to 4,000 stops, so about 10 a day, basically, and that works out to about 1 per officer per shift, roughly speaking.
Less than one per
Less
officer
than
per
one.
shift, I
So
would say.
I was actually on a shift that was above average.
But that
because
also
we stopped
includes
one.
the steps. So if you pull out the step stops, I would say it's way less than that.
Okay.
For-
And do you know how many calls for service we get on an annual basis?
For all of it, including traffic stops and traffic accidents and follow-ups and everything, it's about 30,000.
30,000, 30,000? So like almost 10 times.
That's well, so in that is also included the traffic stops that you're referring to. So
Okay.
that's the whole pool.
So several, for maybe every 5 or 6 calls for service, there's a traffic stop, something on that order.
It's more like 2.
So we get many more calls for service than we do traffic stops. So that kind of explains why we were running around so much doing other stuff and not doing traffic stops. So just that sort of thing helps you kind of get it in your mind what's going on. I do agree with Durrell as far as a lot of the disparity is probably coming from where we're stopping people. What I'm more conflicted about is, you know, what do you do about it? And just looking at and knowing that we had problems at Aspen Court, and the only way they were solved was to have somebody go out there every hour and drive around and make sure that, you know, the people that were causing the problems weren't coming back. And just I think it's pretty much accepted that the presence of a police car in that type of situation is a deterrent. So when you have a hot spot, that seems like the right way to address it. And then going back and forth from there, you're going to be perhaps seeing traffic violations. So then what do you do? So, you know, one thing, I mean, looking at the numbers and seeing that the officers stopping, you know, a handful of people per week, usually on a traffic stop, to get that disparity, it's like once every 2 weeks they're going to stop an African American when the statistics say they should have stopped a white person. So how do you get at that disparity and do something about it? The only way I could think of is, you know, if the officer sort of in their mind understands that disparity, understands the situation, and when they're patrolling these hot spots and they pull somebody over, they would be more likely to give them a warning if they can, because they could recognize that you know, that particular stop might be a little bit more aggressive than what would have happened on a statistical basis.
Well, one of the things I think that Melissa has brought up previously is that once we actually make a stop and we have spoke to the driver, and now we're going to write the piece of paper, because we're required to write some sort of piece of paper based on the IDOT direction. So we either have to give them a warning or a citation, that once we know the race of the driver, the disparity is the same. It is equal for Caucasian and white. Excuse me, a Caucasian and African American. So
So there's
there is no
yeah, so
disparity
there's
when
no
we do know
bears-
the race.
There's no bias in whether you get a warning or a ticket.
Correct.
Right. And I guess I'm saying maybe there ought to be. maybe there ought to be more likely to get a warning. And I think Eric's mentioned that before too. We've considered that, but and, you know, that's probably not something we can direct. I don't know. So I think that's kind of the frustrating thing is the numbers being as spread out as infrequent in order to make up this disparity makes it hard to kind of identify which stops are the ones that shouldn't have happened and what do you do about it. You did mention, Melissa and I exchanged email earlier, and you mentioned that you might be looking at some spatial autocorrelation with traffic volumes and stops. So I know this is all still pretty new, all the mapping and the spatial stuff. So I'm encouraged by what you've done so far, and I'd say if you can do something with that, that would, especially on the secondary and non-main streets, and look at some of the differences that Dura was pulling out. I think some of the maps that show, it'd be interesting to actually look at some of the ones where the stars were like Vine and Washington, maybe? Was that one of the stars? Where you'd expect there to be some stops and actually make sure there weren't any there, because sometimes data can get lost or do funny things. But that's all I have for now, I think.
Can I ask a question, just because it's come up a couple times? So maybe some kind of definition on what you consider to be a non-thoroughfare, like Washington Avenue, clearly for people that live in Urbana is a thoroughfare to get from one end of town to the other, depending on where they're going. Philo Road also is, Florida Avenue and Lincoln, and of course University and Cunningham. So
Yeah, I think the average daily traffic numbers.
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify that, because I think that that's important to make sure that what my idea of a thoroughfare is may not be the same as yours.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure we're clear about that, because I do
No.
consider Washington Avenue
Definitely is.
clearly a well-traveled road. Okay.
Yep.
Mary Alice?
One thing we haven't talked about yet is we've been talking about discretion, officer discretion, and primarily we've been talking about officer discretion in terms of where to patrol. But one thing that we haven't talked about is officer discretion in who to stop. And what I mean by that is a reason, a traffic violation, a type of reason that they would stop them. So maybe they notice that somebody's not wearing their seatbelt, or maybe somebody's speeding 5 miles over the speed limit or 10 miles over the speed limit. So I know that we have data on traffic violation versus targeted patrol. Sorry, I'm always mixing up those words, and community policing. So we have kind of the reasons. We also have equipment violation and so forth. My question to you is, do we have data that can tell us initially what was the reason that the person initially pulled that person over?
Yeah, so there's the reason for the stop is always the violation. If the first violation, we have that data. And then there may be other violations that are found once they've been stopped, where maybe they don't have insurance, or there's something else, maybe something they didn't see, the registration was expired or something. But the initial violation, we do know what the initial violations are. And then
So
we don't
so
know
let me
that.
clarify for a second. Sorry.
I know what the violation is, but I don't know what's the first one. So if there are 3 violations on there, I don't know which was
Okay.
the reason. So it's written on I've had some conversations with IT, and I think that we're going to be able to get it pretty close without changing the way that we do data entry. So it's a conversation, and I
So
think that
we
can do
have it.
but-
It's just a matter, we would have to go hand by hand to do that. So I apologize. Yes, we
That's
do
okay.
know. It's just not
That's okay.
something that is easily pulled out. So
But moving
apologize.
forward, next year, I think it would be very interesting to see if we have a different mechanism for pulling people over. Implicit or not implicit, right? If we are saying, okay, we're going to pull over everybody who has broken taillights, and it happens to be that people who don't have as much income might not be able to keep their cars up. as well. Okay, just an example off the top of my head. It's not necessarily true. But I would like to know what the primary reason that they pull people over, not just traffic violation, but what specific of that traffic violation was that person.
We'll have to look into that and see if that's
That's
something they
fine.
can easily get taken care of.
That's fine. And then my second thing is that I would just like to say that I was one of the people who talked about providing information prior to our meeting, and I know I said it at that meeting. I'll say it again. I would like to make a formal request that we use the annual report as a framework for the follow-ups and be able to insert our follow-ups for each quarter or whatever the timeline that we're going to be doing. In that way, we will have all of the information that we need as council members to understand the data that's being presented to us. At the same time, we will be able to provide that information before a presentation is made. So, Mayor, I'd like to make that formal request that we move forward with that in the next fiscal year. Next year, not fiscal year.
The annual report.
Yes, after the annual report is established, I'd like to use that as the foundation for us to be able to put in our updates and then hand that out prior to the council meeting, that it'll be presented at, prior to the committee of the whole.
Okay, I need to understand what you're asking, though. I don't think I'm quite.
So one of the things that I noticed, this is only the second time that I've seen this report, the presentation that you provided to us has a number of slides that are identical to what we saw in July, right? So we have the number of traffic stops, we have the step traffic stops. These are all the same graphs, right? We're just updating it.
Some of them are different, but most of them, I'm just entering the data from the most recent 2 quarters
Exactly.
instead of what was there before.
For the most part, they're much the same, right? So what I'm saying is, if we have an annual report that has basically the standard graphs that we've been seeing over the past 2 quarters, then we can use that, and we can insert the new slides for the quarters that we're going to be.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And
I think we
so
can do that.
we can do that?
If there's new data to be presented, though, we'll have to see what the best way to do that is.
So I would say, so with the annual report is, or at least the last time was considerably in more depth, and this is more like a quarterly dashboard. So
Yep.
if there was a format where it was, there was a methodology for this and not for everything, if I were to update this, I think that would, yeah.
Eric?
So the purpose of the stops for moving violations is safety. Are there any data, are there any studies that suggest the differential deterrent effect for, continuing to drive badly between a citation and a warning? I'm thinking, I was moved to ask this by listening to Bill's comments about, well, maybe if you stop somebody in a poor neighborhood, maybe should be more inclined to give a warning. And I think that might be fine unless that is sort of a license to go off and drive badly again. So I wonder if there are any data that talk about the relative deterrent capabilities of warnings and citations.
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Not that I'm aware of.
We could do an experiment.
Aaron, and then Dennis?
Get my gum out my mouth. So, one of the things that, in talking to some of the other officers, the reason for the stops, when we're in a area where we say, okay, there's more crime or things are taking place there, okay, and there's this beat, and then there's this sort of hot area within that beat. The officers who are patrolling that area, if the objective is to patrol the streets to make sure that we don't have as many accidents, to keep the streets safe in that regard, then that should not lead to such a disparity that we see in the traffic stop data. The actual reason for the stop, if we're just being completely transparent, a large percentage of the time is that the officer has suspected, identified, or saw something about or the person in that vehicle and used a traffic infraction as the reason to stop that vehicle. But the motivation for the stop was so that I could see who's in this vehicle, right? Isn't that true, Chief Morgan?
I would not agree with that. Well, you're asking me to have some kind of insight into
Policing.
people's brains, individual people, officers, and how they are doing what they're doing. I have to rely on their instruction on how they fill out their paperwork and filling out the data that we collect on the back of that, which is way more extensive than any other police department collects. And we ask them those questions and we educate them on how to answer those questions. And I have to rely on them answering those questions honestly.
But
So
Chief,
you're
you
asking me to
said
do something
earlier
I
that
can't do.
These, we do use, that the police department does indeed use traffic infractions so as a reason to stop someone that they think is suspicious, maybe suspected of a crime or something, because you have to have a reason to stop that person.
That is one of the tools that we use, yes. I did not deny that.
Right. So that's all I'm getting at. I'm saying that that plays a part when we
It
say
does.
we're in a, so speaking to the idea of what not Durrell, but what Bill was saying about citations. Certainly if, as an officer, I say, okay, Melissa's suspected of breaking and entering, there was a report that a white lady in black shirt and red pants, and I see that she just got into this car. I want to stop this car. I just wait for some infraction because something's going to happen that didn't stop 100 feet, whatever the reason may be. And then I use that as a reason to see if Melissa is actually the person who fit that description, right? Well, once the officer finds out that maybe she is or maybe she isn't, certainly if I know or the officer knows that they just used whatever traffic violation they could to stop the car, that would be an ideal opportunity to issue a citation or a warning as opposed to a ticket in that situation. Do you agree with that?
So you're mixing, there's either a citation, which has a fine attached to
Well,
it,
I mean,
and a warning. They're
I'm saying a
they're two
warning.
different things.
I'm saying
So-
in that situation,
Yes.
it appears to me that the officers, from a standpoint of integrity, knowing that they used the traffic code or a violation as a means to see what's happening inside their car, not to keep the streets safe from traffic accidents, that would be the ideal time for them to use a warning as opposed to a citation. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. So, and my last point would be that I think it's fair as we look at the geographic concerns and ideas that put forth by Durrell, and I think the colleagues here are starting to think about as well. And I respect the fact that we have a software to tell us more clearly about the spatial stops. But it's important to say that if we say that Bradley Avenue from Lincoln to Wright Street has been a raceway, certainly First Street to Lincoln Avenue or First Street to Ray Street on Windsor is like the Indianapolis 500 then, right? So then we would have to see a correlation that matches that mindset in the step data that Mary Alice was talking about, right? That would be a logical conclusion, don't you think?
Sure. Yes.
Okay.
Well, First Street is in Champaign, so our actual part of Windsor
I
Road
get
would
it.
start
Right.
just a little bit west of
Well, there's
Lincoln.
some long
and-
stretches of Windsor Road.
Yes.
We can take
Yes.
Philo Road to Lincoln Avenue or Philo Road to Ray Street. It's
Right.
still-
Windsor to out to 130 is really bad, and so is Race to Philo. I mean, yeah, Philo to 130, and yeah, those two stretches are our biggest problems with speeding.
All right.
Oh, Dennis and then Jared.
Okay.
To support Aaron's concerns or comments about the fact that it's known that the police will use a traffic violation to check on an activity that's happening or suspected to be happening concerning a driver. I'd like to say that I haven't been on a lot of police ride-alongs, but I did do one a couple years ago, a couple days after there was a kind of like a gathering gang, not a gang, but it was a crowd disruption on Austin Boulevard and Hunter. And in my ride-along, we were in that general area. We're on Washington, and my officer that I was with pulled over a car because when they made their left turn, they went into the right lane, the right-hand lane instead of the left-hand lane on the turn, i.e. they pulled into the right-hand lane to go eastbound rather than on the left-hand lane, which to me made sense because usually a left-hand lane is a passing lane. But if I got these lanes right, maybe it was the other way around. But the police officer stopped that car because of pulling into the wrong lane on a left-hand turn, which I never heard of in my life that it mattered. And the reason they stopped it was because, well, 2 days ago there has been a disruption in the neighborhood, and they're just checking to see, if there are people who are still disruptive. It turned out that it was a woman and her, 18-year-old daughter, and they were like half a block from their home, and they were just going home. Yes, it was a black family. And I kept wondering, why did that stop happen? That, I guess you'd call, is a pretextual stop. I guess that's a classic pretextual stop. It's done to investigate a suspected criminal activity, although there was no criminal activity done, and the infraction was so insignificant in my mind that I didn't even know that there was a rule. So I'm wondering if there are procedures or rules in our code which allow officers to take very liberal interpretations of what an infraction is, because they can get down to very minute infractions to either to enforce or not enforce. And I'm wondering if that's something that we need in our civic code to be concerned with and reviewing.
So that's a vehicle code violation that you're talking about, that you have to, when you make a turn, you turn into the nearest lane, whether you're turning a right-hand turn or a left-hand turn, doesn't
Right.
matter. That is a vehicle code violation, and so stopping that vehicle, you refer to it as pretextual. I don't think I would agree with that actually being pretextual. Did they stop that vehicle because they were wanting to stop some vehicles in that area because we'd had an issue nearby, and just showing that we're present in this area, we're watching things, we're trying to make sure that we don't have any other problems? That was likely the motivation for that stop. Not necessarily thought that particular vehicle was doing something other than making the vehicle violation of turning into the wrong lane.
That's correct.
Okay.
So the officer
I
was
agree.
supposedly doing due diligence, but to the family that they stopped, it was mere harassment. And that's one of the problems that we have, is that the community sees it as just being harassed because the infraction is so insignificant that nobody in their right mind would imagine being pulled over for that reason under normal conditions. So the other thing I want, Durrell was talking about kind of like a pie chart where 70%, 80% of all stops in the IDOT report are for traffic violations, 19 to 22% were for community education, and 1.5 to 5% was for targeted patrol and investigation. So does a pretextual stop, based on the story I just told you, come in that 1.5 to 5%? Or should there be a fourth piece of the pie for what would be called a pretextual stop?
No, I would say that would have gone into the category of targeted patrol. They were targeting the area of town based on what had happened 2 days prior.
Okay, right. But now I can't remember what this what the ultimate result was. I don't think that a ticket was involved. I think it might have been a warning. I can't remember for sure. I don't think that the family was very happy, but I did not leave the police vehicle to find out further what the conversation was. But the officer did tell me that the reason why that person pulled the car over was because, really not because they had caused what might be a hazardous action, because there was nobody on the street when this happened. There was no other traffic. It was at night and there was nothing going on. But it was completely because they wanted to check. And as a person who lived in a bad neighborhood in Phoenix, when I'd pull out of my driveway, I'd be stopped by a police, and they say, "Do you know what Ricky's doing?" And Ricky was the guy who lived in the house behind me. Well, why would I know, and why would they use me to find out what somebody else is doing in the property? So that's not this town, but I mean, these things do happen and they're used. And the other thing I want to ask, and it's a different topic now, is you said that the basic traffic violation fine is $120. Is our ticket fee based on what is considered to be due recovery for officers' time, or is this because I know that we have increased fees for parking violations and other things to raise revenue in the city. So I'm wondering if it's a useful thing to consider reevaluating a $120 fine or fee for traffic violations, and perhaps like cut it in half so that these things are less disruptive to the financial lives of quite a few people who have these experiences.
So that's not
Can
set
I interject
by us.
here? The statement that you just made that our fees and fines are set to raise revenue is not correct. We've done very careful analyses, and this was even before I took office, but very careful analyses have been done of the actual costs associated with certain programs and services. So to make a statement that
Not all.
we're
I'm not saying
raising
all there, but I'm sure,
revenue.
I know that that was absolutely right, Mayor. But in some instances, we have raised fines because we're trying to increase revenue.
So the traffic violation, that fee is set by the state. We don't have any control over that.
Okay, thank you.
Jared.
I know it's getting late. We're all getting through with this, but I just wanted to comment on a comment made by another council member, and I don't know, maybe my more research friendly other council persons can help look into this with me. But I wrote down the question: does officer presence deter crime? And I know we're telling a lot of stories anecdotally. Anybody who knows me knows that I have a past that's not exactly conducive to where I sit today. You wouldn't recognize me a long time ago to the person who is now. I know another council member on this council can relate to that experience. But I can tell you from my experience when I was participating in not so lawful activities that police presence had nothing to do with what we were doing. That didn't mean a thing to us. When I mean, they were doing whatever they were doing. In fact, with some of the things that I was doing, you wanted to see them because you knew where they were. You could watch them, and you could make a move based on what they were doing. I mean, anyway, I just wanted to make it clear that I'm not in agreement that I think that police presence is a complete deterrent for crime, that it's a one-to-one comparison. I'm sure it does have an effect, but I would be interested, and I'm talking to you, Mr. Jacobson, about
Sure.
looking into
Yeah.
if there's any actual analysis on that as well,
Yeah, so
not just my anecdotal story.
Eric?
So I have, in that section of the traffic study report that I had a big hand in drafting, I cited the papers on which I based my statement. Those, that's a couple of years old, so I could update that, but the statistics are really pretty clear that if you do a controlled experiment in a city, and in some parts of the city you have a higher, in some parts of the city you do hotspot policing, more intense policing in high crime regions, and less intense elsewhere, and then in another part of the city you do equitable policing without regard, then the outcome is really clear. The crime goes into those areas where there's less policing.
And another, oh, Dean, go ahead.
I just wanted to point out that pretextual stops are affirmed by the United States Supreme Court. It's not just something that the Urbana Police Department or Champaign does. Sometimes it might appear that that's just a local thing when we're talking about that here, but that's something that's done nationally. Moving on from that, my question for Melissa is, what happens to traffic stop numbers as the sun goes down? Do the traffic stops increase or decrease?
I have it on my computer. I ran it, as you had requested earlier, on the disparity ratio, and I broke it down into, I think it is 6-hour breaks. And so from 7 a.m. to the full one, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. when it's lighter outside, the disparity ratio is, I think it's about 1.4, and then from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. it's above that, so it's 1.7 ish. I can.
So it increases, the disparity decreases as the sun goes down, as it gets.
There's
or I got it backwards.
There's a higher disparity ratio in the overnight hours than there is when it's daytime, when it's 7 a.m. to 7 p.m.
Do you have an explanation for that? If that's not outside your area, or chief?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Do you have any thoughts on that? I do not have
I
any
do
thoughts
not.
on that.
I just ran the.
Yeah.
I just broke the stops into different hours, and then those are the numbers that were there.
Okay, thank you.
Well, considering we're approaching 10 o'clock, or actually we're past 10 o'clock, are there other different perspectives the council wants to offer at this point? If not, otherwise, I think it's clear that it's important to stay focused on traffic stops, to stay focused on geographic location, and it seems that there's clear interest in that. So we'll go from there. I also wanted to let people know that the next phase of community input and outreach will be January 23rd from 6 to 8 p.m. We will be hosting a community meeting at the Urbana Civic Center to get input on traffic stops, experience of citizens, and perspectives. And hopefully by then we may have some recommendations to share with the public. So January 23rd, 6 to 8 p.m., Urbana Civic Center. Also, our community outreach officer, community outreach coordinator, Preston James, is working with Urbana Youth to film a video which is an educational video, but it goes through the steps in a traffic stop, describing why an officer does what he or she does in a stop from beginning to end, and how a citizen should respond, and then there will be examples of how not to respond during a traffic stop. But it's an educational video and really aimed toward young people, since there is a greater concentration of people. I think is it 16 to 24 who are subject of these stops. So Preston is working with youth to film that, and I think they're going to focus on doing that over the Christmas break. Yes, Aaron?
So when we talk about the timeline, so when you send recommendations and you're looking at some of the spatial and geographical things and where the focus of policing is, what can we sort of reasonably expect would be, how long is it going to take before you change the initiative or direct the officers to, hey, spend more time on Windsor Road or any of those particular areas?
Well, we need to meet. I need to meet with staff to discuss that. I don't have a timeline yet.
Oh, I was talking, I didn't know if Sylvia, as the chief, was going, I'm saying this is a UPD thing. I didn't know if, when you guys looking at the data and stuff like that, just some sort of, right now, I feel like it's just up in the air, and we'll get back to you. It doesn't say when. Are we going to talk about this again in 2 weeks? Or are you going to call us together? You want one-on-one meeting? I don't have any next steps, so to speak, with a timeline associated with it. So that's why I'm just raising that.
So I have been having meetings, and we've been discussing some of the things that we think are things that we can try to make some changes with. Not willing to speak about those publicly for obvious reasons. And I think that that's something that we're going to be trying to change soon. And I think that whether or not that has any effect is going to be something that we look at when we look at the updates.
So when you say, are you saying 3 or 4 months from now, we won't be able, is that how long it would take for you to see if there's a change? Or is that something that Melissa could categorically or statistically see in, 6 weeks or, I don't know?
No, I don't think
a
that
month?
it's going to be sooner than that. In fact, if for data collection type of things looking at would be longer versus shorter, but we do updates quarterly at this point, so that's the closest we would look at it. I wouldn't be asking her to do analysis of stuff any more regularly than that, because it's difficult enough as it is based on everything else she has going on, trying to get these things done as well.
And I will say statistically, before we can expect to see any kind of changes in the numbers, the information that I'm presenting is 6 months. I know that it's a quarterly update, but it's a rolling 6 months. When I run it for 1 quarter, there's not enough to be able to make any conclusions from. So it's the information that was presented last week is for the rolling 6 months, so Q2 and Q3. So that would be, it would need to have a full 6 months worth before you could, it's going to be contaminated with previous stuff.
And so the reason why I raise it then is that means that whatever changes that you decide to make as chief and different instructions or patterns of policing and stuff like that, how long would that have to be in place before your analysis? I mean, 6 months I think is a reasonable.
6 months, I think that's the lowest amount of data that Melissa feels comfortable working with. At least that's my understanding from my conversations with her. So it would take 6 months before I would say, okay, now we can see we've got a little bit of a dip, or that's not working, or whatever the results would be.
And that speaks to then what I'm saying about the urgency then of your new direction or whatever changes that you're going to make. That would have to happen like ASAP in order for her to be able to make that report in 6 months then. I mean.
Correct.
Okay. All right.
That's correct.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. I think we have some things to work with. Seeing no further business before the council, well, I should let you know that ribbon cutting on Airport Road is December 7th. What time? 2 p.m. And the Highland Green dedication is December 11th, so we'll
Yeah, is that next Monday?
lost track of the date.
In the December, I have a graduating son.
We
so-
will send out a notice about those two. Thank you. This meeting is adjourned.